In every revolution, there's one man with a vision.
You can't handle the truth.
And welcome, folks, to Truth versus News. This is April 22nd, the day after Easter and Holy Week. It was quite an active, interesting week here. That was not as best as it could be when you have problems in France and Sri Lanka and other places. But we're here and we're following the Mueller thing. We got all kinds of stuff to report. I've seen the slides today. We got the best minds in America, Jim Petzer, the most dangerous mind, and Michael Jane, Scott Bennett. We're here to present you with 2 hours of the best news production in the world, and you can't get it any better. You better start taking notes. And Jim, how about the Democrats and Republicans following Mueller? Any comment on that?
Well, I think Trump did a brilliant job with this tweet. After all, if you assume there was Russian involvement in affecting the election, it was under the Democratic president, not Trump. So if you accept the Mueller's exoneration of the Trump team as having no involvement, but you want to insist there was still Russian involvement, how do you impeach a Republican president for a crime that was committed by the Democrats? Brilliant tweet by Donald Trump, and we know, and you can trace it. I've laid it all out. The Russia hoax comes apart at the seams. Go to 153news.net. This was a Barack Obama, Loretta Lynch, James Comey, Hillary Clinton, and a host of other lesser players operation. So I think that this is a heavy dose of reality. This is a bucket of water in the face of the Democrats. We know, as I've been reporting, that Devin Nunes has been outlining key aspects of this that require investigation. The targeting, framing of Michael Flynn and the positioning of a false narrative around innocuous Russian contacts, the use of Joseph Mifsud as an asset by the CIA, FBI, running a counterintelligence operation against the Trump campaign, and the Trump Tower meeting as organized by Fusion GPS. And I'd just like to emphasize the fact that this is a counterintelligence operation means it's not a normal criminal probe. You can have obstruction of justice of a normal criminal investigation. A counterintelligence op, however, is being run by the president. It's not at all apparent that it's even possible that Trump could obstruct justice in relation to a counterintelligence. For the first time, Devin Nunes has confirmed it was Robert Mueller who blocked delivery of documents to the House investigative committees. What might be old news to some, it confirms our earlier research that it was Mueller and Rod Rosenstein who were protecting DOJ interests by using the Russia probe as a shield. Now, interestingly, Rod Rosenstein at an Easter egg hunt at the White House this weekend was present, which one thinks would be highly odd if he were a bad guy. I suspect Rod Rosenstein turning out to be a good guy, but others featured here, including John Brennan, James Comey, James Clapper, obviously very bad. We also have a fascinating report from LaRouche. Trump fired Comey to carry out his campaign pledge to work with Russia. There's one major story buried in the scurrilous Mueller report that must be made known internationally and immediately. As LaRouche PAC's Barbara Boyd writes in her report on the Mueller document, in the original letter which Trump dictated to Stephen Miller firing Comey, Donald Trump said that Comey's refusal to state publicly Trump was not a target was specifically inhibiting what the president wanted to do with Russia with respect to trade and with respect to collaboration on eliminating ISIS. With the intervention of the same staff, the media are portraying as unsung heroes. Rod Rosenstein's screed, referencing Comey's misconduct, in the Clinton investigation was substituted as the rationale for Comey's firing. This, of course, created the entirely false narrative the president cover-up his real reason for firing Comey. It may have done that, but the real reason was totally legit. This is fascinating. CIA chief uses duck photos to trick Trump into anti-Russia move, while Trump is now making any number of hostile moves he never really originally intended toward Russia of his own accord. A member of his cabinet, CIA Director Gina Haspel, has been contriving to mislead him when the alleged Novichok poisoning happened in Salisbury in March of 2018. Trump was not inclined to go along with recommendations to take a strong move against Russia. She was tasked with convincing him and showed him Trump fake photographs of dead ducks, claiming they were poisoned in the sloppy Russian action. This is fascinating because we actually know that pets at their home, which would have been killed had it been real, actually survived perfectly intact. And it does not speak well of Gina Haspel. Here's a cartoon that says it all. Barr has no proof of spying. Attorney General implies Exhibit A, FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign. What could be more obvious? What could be more blatant? Scott.
Yeah, I think we're witnessing the slow collapse of the house of cards being removed. The first card being this whole Mueller report release. Simultaneous is the Russian report that was released about the Mueller report, which came out of the Embassy of Russia in Washington, D.C. And people can get that too as a companion, and it's only 198 pages, and it provides the Russian counter to the Mueller report and clarifies a lot of the key issues that the Mueller report intentionally leaves nebulous and intentionally leaves out key information which would have disqualified that entire portion of the Mueller report being applicable or genuine or honest. Instead, the Mueller report is going to be revealed as an entire propaganda campaign covered with muck and feces to try and make it just too odious and too complicated for people to gather into. But we see things from George Papadopoulos' interview with Larry King on Politicking, where he says he was approached by people who suggested the Russians had the emails of Hillary Clinton, and those people were FBI informants. So the FBI used informants to communicate with George Papadopoulos at a meeting and suggest that there were emails that were in the Russian hands, and no one and Mueller left that out in the report. There's countless people that are coming up that were targeted in this that have been on Tucker Carlson and others, and you'll see them again, I think, this week. More and more, these people are going to be questioned about all of the eccentricities that surround their particular testimony or questioning, and you're going to see them, I can't remember the other gentleman's name who was on Tucker last week, who said the same thing. FBI informants were used to question me, to make this suggestion, to give me this information. And that really is, I don't think it's unethical. It's abuse of government. It's an abusive process. It's fraud on the court. It's a violation of the constitutional rights. It's a violation of the government authority. This is essentially the government setting people up for sting operations as part of a larger anti-Trump operation. So the whole thing is in a slow avalanche, a slow meltdown. The Democrats know that. That's why they're reflecting this emotional meltdown as well. You're going to see them get worse and worse. And frankly, Jim, we should view this as a gift. The more the Democrats come apart at the seams, the more they go after Trump, the more they scream impeachment, the more average Americans are going to detach themselves from them politically and incline to not vote Democrat, which is voting for a Republican, or to switch and vote for Trump. So this, in many ways, is going to be very, very good. The Democrats are too wrapped up in this religious fervor. And I think there's been some very good intelligence analysis describing how this is not a partisan political action. This is now a religious self-definition crusade where Democrats and the mainstream media they cannot give up this freedom fighter, truth seeker, we're doing Captain America's work mentality, because they would completely disintegrate. But that mentality, that attitude, is completely the opposite of reality, and more increasingly you're going to see these people completely out of touch with reality, and that's how the public is going to increasingly perceive them. Democrats and the media are out of touch with reality, therefore nothing they say, do, or write can be trusted as reflecting reality. They're in a fantasy world, and they need to be medicated or put down. Jim?
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And the new polls are showing that since the Mueller report has been released, that a group has been affected, not the Republican base, not the Democrat base, but the independents. And the independents are moving in favor of Trump as a consequence of the release of the Mueller report, which is what you would expect of persons who had a modicum of rationality remaining at their disposal. Michael J.
Right. Good.
Thank you, Scott and Jim. I believe that what we're witnessing here and now in this season is a continuation of the highly developed, highly sophisticated dialectic where we see Republican versus Democrat, but it's a managed dialectic, because I'm judging Mr. Trump not by what he says, but what he refuses to say. I'm judging him not by his promise to put these people in prison, but by his lack of willingness to actually do something overt, necessary, courageous, because these people have obviously committed treason. Hillary Clinton has obviously committed war crimes. The people surrounding her have obviously murdered witnesses against her. The pedophiles in Pedophile Island and their junkets over to Epstein's Island include Trump. They include that lawyer, attorney, what's his name, Dershowitz. They include people that are being managed. So I see that we understand that Bob Mueller was the cover-up specialist that was used as far back as the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building and the World Trade Center, and he managed the crises over the propaganda psyop that was the Boston bombing in Sandy Hook. He and the Democrats are being exposed, but this exposure is so obviously also brought to the point of caricature, because if people are actually thinking that these people are not being forced by their masters to go to the extreme, to give the illusion to the American people that this is reality, and yet it's nothing more than a managed theater presentation and spectacle, this is part of the psyop. The reality is that America is in a lot of trouble because of what isn't being dealt with, because Trump hasn't pursued the necessary justice for 9/11. He hasn't exposed the poisoning of the population in the chemtrails or the FEMA camps, and he hasn't shut down the unconstitutional, what's that called, Homeland Security. He's turned over the drone program to the CIA and murdered tens of thousands of people in his 2.5 years. So what we are is witnessing amazing theater. I'm not saying it's not real, because these dialectical problems often end up with people being assassinated. But I'm saying we need to look at this deeper and encourage the American people to start standing up and looking beyond the caricature and demanding reality and honesty. Over to you.
Well said, Michael J.
Yes, very good.
Meanwhile, we have why the Mueller report could turn into a never-ending story on the Hill. This is from the Hill, citing the conclusion here, which is very disgraceful in multiple ways. Because we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment, we did not draw ultimate conclusions about the president's conduct. But the fact is, the role of an investigation isn't to draw that conclusion. That's to be left up to the Department of Justice. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent represent difficult issues that would need to be resolved if we were making a traditional prosecutorial judgment. At the same time, If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment accordingly. While this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. This, in my opinion, impugns the integrity of Robert Mueller, who appears to have known right off the bat there was no case for Russian involvement, delayed his report by at least a year so it would carry over to affect the midterm election, and is making a highly partisan statement, which, if I'm correct in my understanding, that because this was a counterintelligence operation, the president cannot have obstructed justice. This is grossly misleading, purely political. Attorney General Barr released the Mueller report in the middle of the first major congressional recess of the year. He long ago announced he'd make it public in mid-April. The decision frustrated congressional Democrats who viewed the timing as nefarious. House Speaker Pelosi was in Europe. Judiciary Chair Lindsey Graham in Rwanda. House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler, however, was in New York City. The logistics make the release much more difficult. Protests at Blumenthal of Connecticut, a truly despicable member of the Senate. The administration seems to be purposely creating obstacles and hurdles to prevent full disclosure. He added that Barr should have published a report well before the recess. It should have been released the day before it was ready. The fact is, it can't be released without redactions that are required by law. The Attorney General is not letting facts speak for themselves, but baking in a narrative that benefits the White House, and he's doing it before a holiday weekend, so it'll be hard for people to react, said Nadler, who held a press conference in New York City late Wednesday to preempt Barr, then suggested the Attorney General cancel his own morning press conference. Releasing the report during the recess may mute some congressional response, but satellite dishes and TV studios are available this time of year. Twitter remains operational. Most of the country doesn't hang on every word out of Washington or even know whether they're in or out of session. In fact, they accomplish no more in session than out, so why would anyone even notice? Most Americans wouldn't interrupt their workday to call through the Mueller report, let alone actually read it. Not even the members of Congress, for the most part, will do that. They rely on others to divine meaning from the special counsel's missive. Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri drew the lot to serve as the GOP's designated in person at the Capitol spokesman on the Mueller report once he wrapped the gavel on Thursday. Journalists waited for Blunt in the basement of the Russell Senate building to get his views. Congressional Democrats now see a yawning chasm between the contents of the Mueller report and the interpretation presented by Barr. It started with the Attorney General appearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee on May 1st and the House May 2nd. That followed by a prospective appearance by Mueller himself sometime next month. Nadler believes Mueller left a Hansel and Gretel trail of breadcrumbs through the impeachment forest. When asked Thursday about impeachment, Nadler wouldn't rule it out, despite previous statements by Pelosi to the contrary. Atop Pelosi tells Fox that impeachment remains out of the question. We may hear more from Pelosi on this score in the wee hours of Friday when she appears in Belfast. There's peril for Democrats if they continue to discuss impeachment, which is why they must drive down both sides of the street. Impeachment talk harms moderate Democrats from battleground districts, and lots of them would prefer to focus on policy issues like health care, prescription drugs, infrastructure, and even gun policy. However, if liberals push impeachment, moderate Democrats have a chance to contrast themselves with members of their own party. They can say, no, I'm not for impeachment. Let's work on bread and butter issues. There's also a risk for Democrats if they overplay their hand, which is why Republicans are more than happy to lump them all together. The key is how Democrats finesse this to satisfy both wings of their caucus. There's so much here to explore. Trump, his tweet had it exactly right. The vast elements of Spygate are becoming increasingly apparent to the public, and I think increasingly disaffected with Democrats, and any who push impeachment, as Scott was observing, are going to do to their own detriment. This is going to massively harm the Democrats if they go down the path toward impeachment. Scott.
Well, Jim, you know, I did a similar schematic in 2012 when Brad Birkenfeld and I were putting together a lot of the shell game terrorist financing that the Clinton Foundation and the Saudi Arabians and the Israelis and Qatar and the Middle East were doing. And, you know, I've got it in here, Shell Game. So this Epoch Times schematic, which is very well done, has a lot of the furtherance, but I think it's safe to say this started a lot longer before Trump. This started under Clinton and Obama and Eric Holder and Lanny Breuer. This started with UBS and Robert Wolf and Saudi Arabia and others that were using the United States State Department as a pay-to-play operation to get weapons and licenses for engaging in continued Middle Eastern hostilities through the Department of Defense, through U.S. Central Command, and through the State Department and CIA. And they were caught red-handed by Brad Birkenfeld, and they chased him down, and Edward Snowden had been part of that. And when Brad gave me what he had uncovered and released to the FBI and counterterrorism and the Senate and the IRS and the SEC, Eric Holder, Lanny Breuer, it painted a picture of this massive shell game of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars of Swiss bank account money and using it invisibly. And I think that set the first domino to fall, because the same people that are in the Epoch Times Spygate schematic were in our original schematic, which was Dianne Feinstein. She was the Armed Services or the Intelligence Committee chairwoman in the Senate. And she was informed, and she was informed doubly because Senator Bill Nelson contacted Senator Feinstein about who is this Scott Bennett, why does he have this information, he's like Edward Snowden, and blah, blah, blah. So that really was the beginning, I think, of the CIA and the FBI monitoring me, Brad Birkenfeld, and others. I know that because my family members' homes were broken into a month apart, and their computers taken, and that never happens in white bread areas like East Bay, San Francisco. So it was a CIA operation. And then, of course, Michael Isikoff and Tom Hamburger, who came and interviewed me, they also appear on this episode of Spygate because not only did they cover up everything that I gave them about Shell Game, but Michael Isikoff wrote the story about Christopher Steele and Carter Page. And Tom Hamburger wrote the story about WikiLeaks being revealed to Donald Trump Jr. All of that is false. All of that needs to be investigated. Those men need to be investigated as Mockingbird CIA assets. And you're right. All of this is showing a massive government cover-up that Donald Trump is not guilty of anything. He's never been guilty of collusion, neither have the Russians for the most part. And I think we're going to see indictments, we're going to see investigations, we're going to see flanking maneuvers where instead of going down to the fight that the Democrats want to have us in, going and playing in their sandbox, we're going to do a hard left pivot and hit them right from the side and say things like, what do you have to say about the Brad Birkenfeld Shell Game accounts, which was the preliminary for the Panama Papers? What do you have to say about all of this material that Hillary Clinton did at the State Department? Never mind Uranium One, but let's bring out the real corruption. And is this not the beginning of why you started listening into Donald Trump? Because you were listening into Scott Bennett? Because you were listening into the materials that the Russians were obtaining by the videos that he put up? And the Russians had contacted people who put up the videos of me saying, is this guy real? Is this legitimate? That, no doubt, rang so many alarm bells in the corrupt Obama CIA and NSA and FBI that they started listening and started watching. And then this is morphed into a Russian collusion matter. So the timeline of this can be traced back, I think, to 2009. And that blows away the entire fabricated story of, well, we were concerned about Russian influence. No, you were concerned about covering up the massive crimes that Hillary Clinton and Obama and Robert Wolf, chairman of the Americas, and UBS and Saudi Arabia, and Loretta Lynch and Lanny Breuer and Eric Holder and Covington and Burling, which also represents Michael Flynn. Covington and Burling, a corrupt legal organization, that's what you were interested in. That's what you were paranoid about. And that's all that's coming out. So there needs to be a hard flanking hit from the side, like a broadside, opening up a full cannon volley into these people and release more of this material, because it'll give context and background to why this Russiagate, Spygate situation was allowed to unfold. There's a lot more previous chapters. It's like the Lord of the Rings, Jim. Before the Lord of the Rings, you had the Hobbit. Well, Spygate and all this stuff we see now is Lord of the Rings. But Brad Birkenfeld, Snowden, WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and myself are the Hobbit. And both have to be brought up to give context to the full story. Jim?
Oh,
Michael J.
okay. Mute.
Thank you, Jim and Scott. I believe that what we're looking at, as Scott has said, is a big presentation, but it's also a distraction from things that were previous to this. We need to realize that it's evident that Donald Trump, they truly feared him when he came on the scene, although I believe it was orchestrated behind the scenes by the military industrial complex, by the intel people. But at the same time, it represents a real threat to what the Democrats had been doing with the help of George Herbert Walker Bush in setting up America for a globalist takedown, for a UN takeover, for the Jade Helm 2015, for the FEMA camps to be filled. So what we're looking at here, it is still distraction, but at the same time, let's remember that Trump did not elect himself, that tens of millions of people that had been disaffected because they saw all they were being offered were the evil of two lessers in past election cycles. This looked like something that truly was giving America a legitimate and far-reaching hope. And in some ways, it really doesn't have to end. But I think that we're not understanding that the seeds that are being sown in the possible impeachment of Trump, even though it's ridiculous, these are still seeds being sown because the mindset of these people is occult. The mindset of these people includes using a neurolinguistic programming, things that actually telegraph what they're going to do or what might happen. Why? Because the information operation and the information wars that we're dealing with are being complicated by the internet. They're being complicated by people that they don't know how to just outright censor, but they're doing their best with these Israeli technology-controlled platforms like YouTube and Google and Facebook and other things. So what we're actually experiencing is that the American people were the ones that put Trump in office in ways that surprised everybody. They were totally persuaded. They, the wicked, were totally persuaded that Hillary had it because they knew about the deep system operations of voter corruption, voter fraud, and whatever, and they thought they couldn't lose. But this was a victory for the American people. But Trump right now, with all of his promises, I think he could afford to make some promises before he was elected and get the American people excited. But the problem was many Americans believed him. And the problem was that's why they elected him. And when he started having a reality check from his masters about rolling back and walking back his promises not to promote regime change and to be friendly with Russia, all of a sudden there was panic on both sides of the aisle because these demented, anti-American, anti-sovereign nation globalists feel a little bit out of control right now, and because their agenda and timetable has been sidetracked by the real Americans. So I think really now is the time when Americans need to stand up, like somebody said, now is the time for every good man to stand in defense of his country. This is more than a typing slogan. This is a reality of we need to understand America has never been in more danger, and a lot of the things we're seeing around us, not the least of which is using directed energy weapons against Americans, and the very real probability it was used to start the fire or continue to sustain it in Notre Dame Cathedral. But these are the weapons of people who, like Eric Swalwell has said, well, if they won't give us their guns, we do have nuclear weapons. This is the kind of mindset we're dealing with the sociopathic monsters that pretend to be humans in this contemporary generation. Jim?
Yes, indeed. So we have a fascinating development in Ukraine. Poroshenko is out. Zelensky is in. The West backed the wrong man in Ukraine. Now it's payback time, as we've reported many times. Victoria Nuland, as Undersecretary of State, spent $5 billion of taxpayers' dollars to create unrest in the Ukraine to drive out the democratically elected president, to install a Western puppet, Poroshenko. He's now out. Comic Zelensky wins Ukraine presidential vote in a landslide. Fascinating development. With nearly all the votes counted, TV star Volodymyr Zelensky is projected to win the country's presidential runoff in a landslide. The Central Election Commission said Monday Zelensky's won 73% of the vote, while the incumbent Poroshenko got just 24%, with more than 96% of the ballots counted. Unlike most elections in Ukraine's post-Soviet history, Zelensky appears to have won both in Ukraine's west and Ukraine's east, areas that have been traditionally polarized. One of his campaign slogans was to unify Ukraine, which has been torn by bitter debates over its identity, as well as a separatist conflict in the east that is fueled by neighboring Russia. Well, to get the history right, it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who in his book, The Grand Chessboard, suggested that if Ukraine could be pried away from Russia, it would greatly weaken the bear because Ukraine had traditionally been the breadbasket for Russia. It was done in an underhanded way. It appears to me the situation is gradually reversing itself. Even with a landslide to give him a powerful mandate, he has daunting challenges ahead. The simmering deadly conflict in eastern Ukraine and the conundrum over Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, which of course was done in accordance with international law, are likely to dominate the agenda of the man who up till now has only played the president in a TV sitcom. Zelensky, a Russian speaker from central Ukraine, promised to step up efforts to reintegrate the East back into Ukraine's fold, but has offered no details on how he's going to do that. In my opinion, I think it will be the West that will come more to appreciate the relationship of Ukraine to Russia. So I think it's bringing the East closer to the views of the West. In a political novice, the 41-year-old will also have to face off against Russia's President Putin, who has ruled his country for nearly 2 decades. If you want to mend relation with Ukraine's neighbor, which is very much to be wished, let's see that it should happen. Scott.
Well, I think Ukraine's shifting to this new comedian is an indication of the lack of confidence in Poroshenko by the people, and the outrage and disgust that they've had at the lack of progress and growth, the lack of positivity. Everything that Poroshenko has done has been negative, has been hostile, has been bloody. And that's a war crime. Victoria Nuland and Barack Obama and the Secretary of State Clinton or John Kerry or both of them in the artificial coup d'etat and the Maidan shooting, all orchestrated by U.S. CIA, MI6, Mossad, no doubt, and mercenaries. That's a war crime. And the overthrow of Yanukovych is a war crime. And the resulting Crimea separation from Ukraine, because they recognized a potential genocide of the Russian language and culture in that geographic area was imminent. That's caused the separation of Crimea from Ukraine. And all of that was orchestrated by this Western coup d'etat. I think Oliver Stone in his Putin interviews did a very good job summarizing the history of that. And it's now being reflected by the removal of Poroshenko. And I would not be surprised, sadly, though, if, as much as I would hope it doesn't happen, I could see this new president, the comedian gentleman, being assassinated. I could see them removing him and blaming Trump, blaming the West. That's a typical ploy, and I hope it's not. But I think this new leader of Ukraine reflects people just want to get along and live in peace and harmony. And Russia has been a part of that society for more than 100 years, and it needs to be recognized as such. And I think Putin will be very, very welcoming, and I think he will be very ingratiating. I do not subscribe to this Western fantasy that Lisa Page and Gina Haspel and John Bolton and Pompeo and all of these people espouse, which is the Russians are the communist menace out to destroy democracy. No, they're no more communists. They're the Russian Orthodox Christian people that are defending themselves from an encircling, strangling military economic sanctions empire, and they're rebuting that. So I think this is a good move. I think it will be very productive for Russia and Ukraine and ceasing their conflict. And hopefully Trump would be wise enough to recognize this is his bridge to Vladimir Putin and engaging this whole area once again with new leadership. You could have a whole recitation of relations. Jim,
Michael J.
Thank you, Jim. Good point, Scott. I think that Trump right now is also being presented with another problem, because under his administration, he was trying to actually uphold and sustain this tyrant, this anti-Russian people that are in, the reality of what happened in Ukraine under Obama set this man up to be the divisive factor in the Ukraine. And like Scott said, all of his actions have been negative, have been aggressive. The reality of our involvement with Ukraine and our stealing the gold in Ukraine and are wanting to make Russia the bad guy because they were protecting eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. All of this has been actually exacerbated by some of the actions of Trump, and I believe Trump was supporting Poroshenko by sending Navy ships into the area in provocations. But this is falling flat. So Mr. Trump has to deal with the reality of this, and like Scott says, very accurately, they need to protect this man Zelensky, because he represents not only a major shift with reestablishing Ukrainian sovereignty, he represents something that will be a realignment with Russia. And so this is a very serious situation, because I believe what the Ukrainian people have seen was that they want to be one nation again. And I think that Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, should demand that whoever stole his gold, and I believe it was the U.S. and NATO, that they give it back to the Ukrainian people. And I believe what this also means is that the Ukrainian, like Scott and I have been, and we've all been talking about for a couple of years now, and that is the Ukrainian people were not ready for the NATO enforced new morality that was promoting the homosexual, transgender, immoral mindset that has overtaken Europe and is being promoted by Israel throughout the world to demoralize Christian populations. So I believe that this is a major answer to probably the prayers of millions of people, and I believe that this has got the globalists shaking in their panties. Jim?
I bet you does.
Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar is being described as disrespectful to the U.S. and disrespectful to Israel by none other than President Trump, which I find acutely disappointing. In an interview on Monday in Minnesota, he said Omar has got a way about her that's very, very bad for our country. She's been very disrespectful to this country. She's been very disrespectful, frankly, to Israel. She is someone who doesn't really understand life, real life. That's what it's all about. She told a reporter. I think Trump's got this completely wrong. I have pointed out that the U.S. mainstream media has been taken over by the CIA and the Mossad, so that we're getting nothing but completely biased reporting. Scott has gone further in relation to the tyrannical censorship of press TV by Google, which is an outrage. But to get a better sense of what Ilhan Omar has had to say, the Jimmy Dore Show had a very nice program, parts of which I want to share.
Ilhan Omar, this controversy. You've heard about this, right? My God. All right, so I know, right? The people have been showing just a part of her speech. So of course, what happened is we got a Muslim American who wears a hijab in Congress, and immediately they started smearing her as like some kind of terrorist sympathizer, course that's what happened. And of course the Democrats are too big of, are in bed with those people doing that to her. And so they're not supporting her like they should. It's disgusting to see. But here's what she said. I'll get, so this will give you the full context of what she said, as opposed to that little clip that this was over a month ago that she said this. And so it's just making the rounds now. So here we go.
It doesn't matter how good you are. If you one day find yourself in a school where other religions are talked about, but when Islam is mentioned, they're only talking about terrorists. And if you say something, you are sent to the principal's office. So to me, I say raise hell, make people uncomfortable. Because here's the truth. Here's the truth. Far too long, we have lived with the discomfort of being a second-class citizen. And frankly, I'm tired of it. And every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it. CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. So you can't just say that today someone is looking at me strange, that I am going to try to make myself look pleasant. You have to say, this person is looking at me strange. I am not comfortable with it. I am going to go talk to them and ask them why. Because that is a right you have.
So that's what she said. And now people are just taking out the clip and they're trying to say she was downplaying what happened on 9/11, when what it's clear what she was actually doing was trying to frame the experience of a Muslim in America and why that's important and why that they're all being held accountable for the actions of some. That's what she was saying. That they're all now looked at a certain way as second-class citizens because of the actions of some. Isn't that what she was saying?
Absolutely.
Okay. So here's how Fox News got upset about it. Let's see.
Freshman Democratic lawmakers now rushing to Omar's defense. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez attacking the New York Post for responding.
Well, first of all, do you see what the Post did?
Disgusting.
So here's what the New York Post did. It said, Representative Ilhan Omar, 9/11 was some people did something. And here's your something. So do you see what's going on? Like, that's happening. Like, that's gross. But, you know, after 2.5 years in Russiagate pushed by the left, so the whole country's lost their fucking mind. So the whole country. And the only people sane are the people sitting in my garage in Pasadena. So that happened. And by the way, she's on their side. And here we go.
Omar, with this cover, watch.
Printing on the front page to circulate all around New York City an image that's incredibly upsetting and triggering for New Yorkers that were actually there and were actually in the radius, that woke up one morning or were in their schools and didn't know if they were going to see their parents at the end of the day. So this is such an image for such a transparently and politically motivated attack on Ilhan. We are getting to a level where this is an incitement of violence against progressive women of color.
And Rashid.
Let me just say here that it seems to me Omar has an impeccable point. I must have needed to go further on the share.
To leave.
So I want to talk.
What Omar is doing is talking about someone did something on 9/11, and of course, thereby she really means she knows. I think it was compliments of the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense and the Mossad that we had what happened on 9/11, and yet Muslims are being blamed for it. So the idea that, you know, the only time that we talk about Muslims are in relation to terrorism, I think she's 100% correct. And that this is very appropriate that she should bringing this out. I'm very impressed by her. I'm disappointed by Trump and by even some of the critics on Fox, like Nicole Wallace, who seem to me to have it wrong. Scott.
Well, Jim, I think part of our training in compartmentalizing material and information is what gives us sort of an edge, and at the same time an ability to agree with people who speak the truth on different subjects. When you compartmentalize intelligence material, you examine and dissect and define every component of that block of material, while at the same time utilizing your analytical abilities to see connections, to see how this one component fits into the larger mechanism of an entire operation. And in this case, you know, we see Omar recognizing that the hostility towards Muslims in general is inconsistent with the personality and practices of Muslims in general. It may be appropriate for Americans to despise the boy-raping savages that get little girls hooked on heroin and turn them into prostitutes, as we've seen apparently in Manchester, England, and elsewhere. Those people deserve death by the most painful ways imaginary to the human ability. But they do not apply to other Muslims that we've encountered and known, such as the Iranian Muslims that I've met and known in my conference attendance, and people like Kevin Barrett, who is an American Muslim. It doesn't apply to the Syrians or the Alawites or others. It just applies to the Saudi Arabians. So the Saudi Arabian Wahhabist is sort of the Mormon cult of the larger Muslim religion. And they're branded as applicable to all of them, and that's been a very debilitating posture, intentionally done, I think, to advance the Israeli wars against that entire Middle Eastern geographic area. 7 countries in 5 years was the original plan. Now, I think, and I'll end it here by handing it back to you, I think Omar represents someone who should be very quickly educated to say, in this particular area, when you said some people did something, did you know those some people may be connected, as you said, to the CIA, the Mossad, the neocon Zionist establishment, Dov Zakheim, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, General Dick Myers, people at the Pentagon? Did you know the Pentagon was impossible to have been hit by a plane? There was no plane found. There was no engine. There was no skid marks. There was no baggage. 757 just doesn't crash into the Pentagon and disappear into liquid. That right there was the thumbprint of the false hoax, which was the Pentagon attack. And additionally, you can look at Building 7 and the Twin Towers. And for Trump to put up this reinforcing psyop that the 9/11 event was a bunch of Saudi Arabians hijacking planes that crashed them into buildings, and that started the World War III of the terror wars, without examining the science and the forensic evidence that proves that that narrative was impossible, that's very debilitating to Trump. It loses confidence in people. So I'll hand it back to you, Jim, and say, what would you say to Representative Omar in sending this particular clip of our show to her about the 9/11 education, Jim?
Yeah, no, I like this. I like this. In fact, I was thinking I need to tweet her about, 9/11, who is responsible and why. She may not know quite enough to get it right to handle the politics of this in a more sensible way. But I mean, you got this petite woman, she might be all of 90 pounds, from Somalia, and she's doing more to put a crucial issue on public discussion than anyone else in the country, in the world for that matter. I put her up there with Edward Snowden and Julian Assange for making a contribution, with Cynthia McKinney. I am in admiration of her, and in every way, I want to support her and help her to get it right and to be even more effective. And in this case, I'm astonished to find myself in agreement with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's right. Omar should not be being attacked here. That's all wrong. And the idea that Muslims are only discussed in relation to 9/11 as terrorists, she's hit that nail right on the head. Michael J. You're muted.
This is an ongoing process, like you and Scott have stated, of educating the American people. And she is a wild card in the deck here, because the reality of her understanding the difference between the Wahhabi and the Shia Muslim is key. Also, the reality of her daring to point a finger at AIPAC and other Zionist-controlled groups, not the least of which is all of our media. The fact is that Zionists also control our money policies through the Federal Reserve. She's actually taking a swing at the golden calf in America. And this is, as far as they're concerned, this is worthy of death. I mean, the reality is that she's a Democrat, and the Democrats are, enjoying their own pendulum swing against what is perceived, and in some ways rightly perceived, as Trump fascism. Although Trump is making a lot of good points with respect to trying to lift up America, I think more of it is words instead of actions. But the issue that we're seeing is that public policy in America has been controlled and is now being controlled by the Zionists. And that's why the very first act of this Senate was about making it illegal to actually promote sanctions against Israel in boycotting them, because they are a fascist, apartheid, racist, uber racist state, probably the most racist state in the world. The issue is most people don't know how to deal with this kind of racism that considers the rest of mankind as animals born to serve the Jews. The issue is, this is the height of racism and beyond anything that we can understand, because it's too unrealistic. It's too irrational for most people to even contemplate it or consider it as real. But the issue is, the truth, like I said, is about education. And speaking of education, when Education Day was first introduced, I believe by Reagan, but possibly by Carter, Education Day included the promotion of what's called the Noahide laws, which provides two different sets of laws for people on planet Earth. One set of laws is for the so-called chosen people, and the other set are for the rest of the sons of Noah. But it is just superficially the promotion of that, because in reality, it's legalizing a process that will bring us under a one world government, new world order, where we will all be controlled under a Zionist cult through the Jerusalem being accepted and promoted as the capital of Israel, and for the establishment of the third temple, which will allow them to have a religious government that they want to rule over the rest of us, like Mordor. So what we're looking at is Omar has made some amazing progress because she's protected, because she's a part of the cult of the Democrats. But at the same time, she's an embarrassment. And so what we're looking at is the American people seem to find themselves in conflict, because, like us, we actually support her saying the truth. But when the truth is being spoken by somebody who's being painted with the tar brush of anti-Semitism, which is, by the way, a despicable behavior on the part of Mr. Trump, this causes confusion and cognitive dissonance. And I believe we should support and reach out to this Omar and encourage her to stand up and continue to shine a light in the darkness. Jim?
Very good, Michael J. It is a complicated situation, and Trump needs to get his head screwed on right. Here we have Pompeo announcing the U.S. is trying to end the Afghan war, the longest war in American history, trying to broker peace between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Of course, we had no business being there in the first place. Negotiations have been ongoing for months, have established a growing understanding where the U.S. withdraws and the Taliban keeps ISIS and Al-Qaeda out. Back on track, the railway linking Iran to Syria through Iraq is so significant. I might reiterate it here. It's going to facilitate better trade link, easier to get across quite a large terrain. Syria announced earlier this month its intention to lease the port of Latakia to Iran from October. It did so in an official response from Tehran to Damascus in February 2018. Since the start of the conflict, Iran has loaned Damascus $6.6 billion, with an additional $1 billion offered in 2017. Opponents of Iran have spoken of fears of the construction of the land corridor from Tehran through Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah and Lebanon. They fear the railway route would facilitate the transport of high-quality weapons, Revolutionary Guards, and Shia soldiers to intervene in regional conflicts. The idea of the corridor says a lot about how other states in the region are viewing Iran. Traditionally, it was the Shia Crescent which evolved into this notion of a land corridor, showing the fear of Iran holding territory in these traditional Arab, traditional Sunni lands. Meanwhile, Chinese diplomats have suggested that Pompeo has lost his mind by U.S. attacks on Beijing's investments in Chile. The Chinese ambassador to San Diego called U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo a hypocrite after he tried to dissuade the South American nation from dealing with Beijing as the U.S. and China remain locked in a trade war. Pompeo has lost his mind and gone too far, Beijing's envoy to Chile, Zhao Bu, said, slamming the attacks against Chinese economic activities in the region as malicious and absurd. Meanwhile, Russia is replacing Venezuelan crude on European markets, another development that is an unexpected consequence of the U.S. being so severe in its sanctions on Venezuela without any justification whatsoever. European refineries are switching to Russian sour grade as U.S. sanctions have shrunk Venezuela's similar grade exports. Reuters reports adding the Russian sour crude is getting increasingly expensive. Meanwhile, Jimmy Carter has some very thoughtful remarks about the U.S. being the most warlike nation in history. He has observed that Trump fears China's growing economic strength, suggesting the president's right to be concerned where China could overtake the U.S. as the world's largest economy by 2030 if current growth continues. He said China is getting ahead of the U.S. because Washington has been at war with other countries for most of its history. He suggests China's rapid growth has been facilitated by government investment and helped by peace. Since 1979, you know how many times China has been at war with anybody, Carter asked? None. And we have stayed at war that entire period of time. The U.S. has only enjoyed 16 years of peace in its 242-year history, making its country the most warlike nation in the history of the world. Carr said China, in contrast to the U.S., has made massive economic progress for maintaining peace. How many miles of high-speed railroad do we have in this country? The U.S. has wasted, I think, $3 trillion on military spending. It's more than you can imagine. China has not wasted a single penny on war, and that's why they're ahead of us in virtually every single war. Take that $3 trillion, put it in American infrastructure, you'd probably have $2 trillion left over with high-speed rail, bridges that aren't collapsing, roads maintained properly, our education system as good as that of South Korea or Hong Kong. Don, I know we have reached a point where we have a break to take, so I turn it over to you.
Yes, this is the first half. Boy, I can't see that, can you? The first half of Truth versus News. And so we thank you very much for watching. What happened to my background? Anyway, this is for the 22nd. We'll be right back. And remember that if truth is politicized, all is lost. And that's sort of what we have here. But we're going to be right back. Thanks so much, guys. This is awesome. Stay tuned.